The autumn wind did not merely blow across the valley of Ashbourne. It hunted, seeking out the fraying seams of cloaks and the hollow spaces in the spirit where hope had once resided. Marianne Thorne stood by the rusted iron gate of her small tenant holding, her spine as straight as the rusted railings themselves, though her fingers had long since turned a shade of porcelain blue against the biting air. In her hand, she held a single sheet of vellum, a heavy, expensive weight that felt like lead against her palm. It was an eviction notice, signed with the flourishes of a man who had never known the indignity of a leaking roof or an empty larder. The sky above was the color of a bruise, a deep, mottled purple that promised a winter of iron and ice, and it seemed to press down upon the thatched roof of Thorne Farm with an indifferent, crushing weight. Bartholomew Finch, known to the fearful villagers as Magistrate Finch, did not dismount from his sleek, black-lacquered curricle. He sat perched upon the velvet cushions, his greatcoat of charcoal wool making him appear like a vulture waiting for the inevitable. He looked down at Marianne, his eyes narrow and glittering with a cold, professional greed. To him, the woman standing in the mud was not a neighbor or a soul in distress. She was a line item in a ledger that refused to balance, a stubborn remnant of a husband's debt that he intended to sweep away before the first frost. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of approaching snow. The silence, it seemed, had teeth. Marianne did not speak first. She had learned long ago that in the presence of men like the magistrate, words were merely stones for them to sharpen their tongues upon. Instead, she looked at the document again, her eyes tracing the jagged ink of the signatures. It was then that she saw it, a small dark smudge of ink on the magistrate's white linen cuff, the exact shade of the indigo ink used to calculate her supposed arrears. It was a fresh stain, a careless mark of a man who had been busy with his nib and inkwell only moments before arriving. She realized then, with a sharp, cold clarity, that the numbers were not the result of a long overdue audit. They were a fiction, a debt conjured from the air to justify her ruin. Magistrate Finch adjusted his gloves, the leather creaking in the stillness. "You have until the turn of the month, Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced rasp that lacked even the pretense of sympathy. "The estate requires solvency, and your husband's mismanagement has left this holding a skeleton. It is a matter of simple arithmetic, you see. One cannot keep what one cannot pay for." He leaned forward slightly, a sneer curling his lip. "I suggest you pack your few belongings and seek a place in the parish workhouse before the roads become impassable. It would be a mercy compared to what the winter will do to this hovel." Marianne Thorne did not flinch, nor did she allow the hot prickle of tears to blur her vision. Tears were a luxury she had discarded 7 years ago, buried in the same cold ground as her husband and the dreams of a fruitful harvest. Instead of pleading, she watched the magistrate's hand as he took up the reins. She began to count. 1, 2, 3. She measured the steady rhythmic beat of his horse's hooves as he turned the curricle away. She was not counting the moments of her remaining stay, but rather the distance between his arrogance and the truth. She stood in the mud until the sound of the wheels faded into the moaning of the wind, her mind already turning to the estate ledger hidden beneath her floorboards, a book of honest numbers that would, perhaps, be her only shield. When the last vibration of the carriage had died away, Marianne turned and walked toward the cottage. The transition from the yard to the kitchen was not one of relief, but of a different kind of endurance. Inside, the air was stagnant and smelled of old wood smoke and the faint, bitter scent of beeswax that she used to mask the damp rot beginning to take hold in the corners. There was no fire in the hearth. The stones were cold and grey, resembling the teeth of a dead animal. Poverty has a distinct architecture. It is found in the way a woman learns to move silently so as not to disturb the dust, and in the way she breathes small so as not to waste the little warmth her body still holds. The house was holding its breath, as if it too knew that the master it had served for 3 generations was about to be cast out. Marianne moved to the heavy oak table, the surface scarred by 1,000 meals and 1,000 prayers. She sat down, her shawl wrapped tight around her thin shoulders, and stared at the grain of the wood. There, caught in a deep crack near the edge, was a single tiny black speck. She reached out, her numb fingers trembling slightly as she teased it out. It was a caraway seed, a relic from a loaf baked long ago, perhaps in a season when the fields had been gold and the table had been full. She pressed the seed into the center of her palm. The small, hard shape a sudden and sharp anchor to a memory she usually kept locked in the cellar of her heart, caraway. The scent of it always brought back the winter of 1805, a winter even more cruel than this one. She closed her eyes, and for a moment the cold of the kitchen vanished. She saw the stable in the flickering light of a tallow candle, the shadows of the horses dancing on the walls. She remembered the boy, a shivering, mud-caked scantling she had found huddled in the straw, his eyes wide with a hunger that went deeper than the belly. She had not had much then either, but she had possessed a half loaf of rye and caraway bread, still warm from the oven. She had given it to him without a word, watching as he tore into it with a desperation that had made her heart ache. He had been a nobody, a stray dog in a world that had forgotten him. Marianne opened her hand and looked at the seed again. It was a useless thing, a fragment of a meal long forgotten, yet she felt a sudden, fierce need to preserve it. She rose and walked to the shelf where her few belongings were kept. A chipped teapot, a single silver spoon, and the heavy leather-bound estate ledger that contained the history of her labor. She placed the caraway seed inside the ledger, marking the page where the magistrate's false numbers began. If she was to be destroyed by ink and paper, she would meet that destruction with her own record of truth. The house remained silent, the wind rattling the shutters like a creditor demanding entry, as the late November light began to fade into a bruised, chilling grey. The knock at the door was hesitant, a rhythmic tapping that matched the uneven, anxious heartbeat of the cottage itself. Marianne Thorne did not look up from the estate ledger immediately. She dipped her quill into the ink, a liquid black as the shadows stretching across the cold stone floor, and noted the dwindling stores of winter oats with a hand that remained remarkably steady. She heard the latch lift and the familiar, labored breathing of Mrs. Halloway as the neighbor stepped inside, the damp chill of the afternoon, clinging to her like a second, less welcome shawl. Mrs. Halloway moved with a peculiar, practiced grace, a way of tucking her left arm against her side to conceal a jagged, poorly mended tear in her wool pelisse. It was a gesture of concealment that Marianne understood without a word of explanation being offered. Poverty in this valley was not a loud, crashing tragedy. It was a quiet, meticulous erosion of the spirit, a series of small, shaming adjustments made in the dark. Eliza placed a small jar of preserves on the scarred oak table, her fingers red and chapped from the relentless heat of the laundry tubs. The jar was only half full, the dark plum jam a concentrated essence of a summer that felt a lifetime away. It was a meager offering, yet in the social arithmetic of Thorne Farm, it carried the weight of a king's ransom. The two women did not immediately discuss the eviction notice that sat like a venomous toad upon the mantelpiece. Instead, they spoke of the weather, of the way the mist clung to the hedgerows, and finally of the rumors that were beginning to circulate through the village like a slow burning fever. Eliza leaned in, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. She spoke of a high official, perhaps even the new master himself, who had been seen at the crossroads in a carriage of such splendor that the local children had mistaken it for a celestial vision. Magistrate Finch had been seen polishing his buckles and shouting at the local constabulary, his face the color of a bruised beet. Eliza spoke of the stranger with a mixture of awe and terror, for in a world governed by the iron laws of land tenure, the arrival of a new duke was rarely a harbinger of mercy. To the villagers, a duke was not a man, but a force of nature, a storm that could either water the crops or wash the entire village away with a stroke of a pen. Marianne listened, her gaze fixed on the meticulous columns of her accounting. She saw the way Eliza's eyes darted toward the empty hearth, noting the absence of a fire. The neighbor's pity was a sharp, stinging thing, yet it was wrapped in a genuine affection that Marianne could not bring herself to rebuff. They discussed the cost of rye and the unfairness of the tithes, their conversation a sparring match of caution and suppressed indignation. Marianne managed the interaction with the same scrupulous care she applied to her ledgers, refusing to let her voice tremble or her spine bow. She was a woman who had mastered the art of being invisible, yet as Eliza spoke of the grand stranger, a strange, phantom olfactory signature seemed to drift through the room, the scent of cold straw and the sharp, earthy tang of caraway seeds. That lingering ghost of a scent pulled Marianne's mind backward, dragging her through the veil of 10 long, unforgiving winters. The memory did not arrive as a gentle reflection. It struck her with the tactile force of the frost that had once threatened to claim the very bones of the farm. It was the winter of 1805, a season when the wind had been a keening widow and the snow had turned the valley into a vast white mausoleum. She had gone to the barn late that night to ensure the livestock were shielded from the gale, her lantern casting long, flickering shadows against the timber walls. There, huddled in a corner behind a stack of moth-eaten blankets, she had found him. He was a creature of bone and grime, a scrap of humanity that the world seemed to have discarded in a fit of parsimony. The boy was perhaps 12 years of age, though the malnutrition had made him appear both younger and ancient at once. He was a scantling, a walking tragedy wearing a child's coat that was several sizes too large and thick with the filth of the London docks. His eyes were grey, the cool, undecided grey of a winter sky that has not yet resolved to clear. He did not beg, he did not offer a name or a history. He simply looked at Marianne with a terrifying, silent dignity that mirrored her own. She had stood there for a long moment, the lantern light reflecting in his wide, hollowed pupils, and she had recognized in him a kindred spirit, a soul that had been broken by the world's arithmetic but refused to vanish. Marianne had not called for the magistrate. She had not driven the boy out into the white dark to freeze in the name of propriety. Instead, she had returned to her kitchen with a quiet, determined step. She had fetched the only luxury she had prepared for her own meager supper, a fresh rye and caraway loaf. The bread was still warm, the crust dusted with a fine layer of flour, the aroma of the caraway seeds pungent and grounding. She had returned to the barn and broken the loaf in half, handing the steaming piece to the boy without a word. He had taken it with hands that trembled. Marianne had watched him, her own heart a heavy aching stone in chest. She had fed a beggar, a nameless stable boy, with dirt beneath his nails and a void in his belly, unaware that she was nourishing a man who would one day hold her life in his calloused aristocratic hands. She had seen him then, truly seen him, when the rest of the world looked at him and saw only a grave. 10 years had passed since that night, yet as the memory receded, the weight of the debt written in the frost seemed to settle into the very foundations of the kitchen, demanding an accounting. Marianne Thorne remained at the scarred oak table, her focus returning to the heavy, leather-bound volume that had become her sanctuary and her cross. In a world where men like Magistrate Finch spoke in the riddles of unjust laws and the cold threats of eviction, the numbers on these pages remained indifferent to the whims of the powerful. It was here, and only here, that her competence was absolute, even if the world outside refused to acknowledge the sharp intelligence of a widow in a threadbare shawl. Her fingers, calloused by the harvest and the mending of stone walls, moved with a scrupulous precision across the columns of grain yields and interest rates. She had audited the farm's production with a rigor that would have shamed a London banker. Every bushel of rye, every pound of wool, and every calculated debt was recorded in her neat, upright hand. It was a map of survival, a geometry of endurance that proved with mathematical certainty that the farm was solvent. If the debt was insurmountable, it was only because the interest had been engineered to be a snare. She saw the malice in the arithmetic, the way Finch had layered fee upon fee until the numbers no longer represented honest commerce, but a slow, deliberate strangulation. The light in the kitchen was failing, the grey afternoon bleeding into a bruised purple at the edges of the horizon. Marianne reached for a small, jagged piece of charcoal, her hand steady despite the hollow ache of hunger in her stomach. She noticed a discrepancy in the final tally of the tithes, a minor error that a lesser mind might have overlooked, but to her, it was a fraying thread in the fabric of her defense. With a sharp, decisive stroke, she corrected the calculation. At that exact moment, the bell of the village church began to toll. It was a heavy, iron sound that rolled across the valley like an omen, marking the hour of the magistrate's return. Each strike of the clapper seemed to announce the end of her reign over these few, hard-won acres, yet Marianne did not flinch. She simply closed the book, her spine as straight as the columns of figures she had mastered. The silence that followed the bell was not a peace. It was a suspension of breath. The house itself seemed to be waiting, its old timber bones bracing for the impact of the coming storm. Marianne looked down at her hands, stained grey by the charcoal and the ink of her industry. These were the hands of a woman who had worked harder than any man in the valley, who had understood the alchemy of the soil and the cruel logic of the seasons. She had worn her dignity like a shield for years, and as the shadows lengthened across the flagstone floor, she realized that she was not afraid of the numbers. She was afraid only of the silence. The way the world could simply look past a woman of her station and see nothing but a grave waiting to be filled. Then the silence broke. It did not break with the sharp crack of a branch or the low moan of a hungry cow, but with a rhythmic, thunderous drumming that vibrated through the very foundations of the cottage. It was a sound that did not belong to the mud-choked lanes of Ashbourne. The frantic, coordinated beat of high-bred hooves and the heavy metallic grind of iron-rimmed wheels. Marianne rose from the table, her heart hammering a different rhythm against her ribs. She moved to the window, pulling back the stiff, sun-bleached curtain to witness an intrusion that felt like a tear in the fabric of her reality. Emerging from the mist like a golden predator was the gilded carriage. It was a magnificent, obsidian-bodied vessel adorned with gold leaf that caught the dying light, a sovereign piece of London ostentation that had no business in the grey, sucking mud of a tenant yard. The horses were black as coal, their coats shimmering with a health that no animal in this parish had seen in a decade. Their breath came in great white plumes of steam, and their harnesses jingled with the bright, arrogant sound of silver. As the carriage swung into the yard, the heavy wheels carved deep, violent ruts into the soft earth, splattering the pristine gold filigree with the filth of the farm. The contrast was a physical blow, the immense wealth of the aristocracy crashing into the stark, stripped-back poverty of Thorne Farm. The liveried footman jumped down. She did not know who was inside, but she felt the weight of a gaze from behind the velvet-curtained windows. A presence that felt both familiar and terrifyingly alien. This was not the magistrate's clumsy carriage or the doctor's modest gig. This was a manifestation of power that could buy and sell the entire county without noticing the cost. As the gold-encrusted door finally began to turn on its silent hinges, Marianne Thorne stepped out from her doorway and into the freezing mud of the yard, her ink-stained fingers clutching the edge of her apron. The world she knew was ending, and she would meet it, standing on the land she still claimed as her own. The door of the gilded carriage did not merely open. It yielded, swinging wide with a heavy, aristocratic sigh that seemed to rebuke the very mud of the farmyard. Arthur Sterling stepped out of the velvet-lined interior and into the raw, unforgiving reality of Thorne Farm. He did not pause to assess the terrain, nor did he wait for a footman to lay a board across the slurry of rain and manure. Without the slightest hesitation, his boots, fine, hand-tooled leather that must have cost more than Marianne Thorne had earned in 3 seasons of harvest, sunk deep into the cold muck. He did not look down at the ruin of his footwear. Instead, his gaze remained fixed, with a singular and terrifying intensity, upon the woman standing defiantly near the barn. She watched the Duke move toward her with a gait that was sovereign and unhurried. The gold filigree on the carriage door caught a stray beam of light, mocking the threadbare shawl wrapped tightly around her chest. This man was an intruder from a world that viewed her existence as a mere decimal point in an estate ledger. Yet, as he drew closer, the expected coldness of a high-born stranger did not materialize. There was a gravity to him, a stillness that reminded her of the ancient stone of the parish church. Weathered, perhaps, but unyielding. His eyes were the color of a winter sea just before the ice sets in, a piercing, intelligent gray that seemed to strip away the layers of her poverty, to see the architecture of the soul beneath. He stopped exactly 3 paces from her, a distance that felt both respectful and profoundly intimate. The absolute stillness between them possessed a razor-sharp edge. It bit into the air, sharpening the senses until Marianne could hear the rhythmic creak of the carriage springs and the distant, lonely cry of a crow in the fallow fields. He did not speak immediately. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, though the tension in his jaw suggested a man holding back a tide of unspoken words. For the first time in 10 years, Marianne felt as though she were being truly seen, not as a widow or a tenant, but as a person of consequence. Marianne did not curtsy. The realization of her own defiance came not as a shock, but as a quiet settling of her internal weight. To curtsy now, with the mud of labor on her skirts and the ink of her ledgers on her fingers, would be to admit his title was more significant than her struggle. She kept her spine as straight as a garden stake, her chin tilted to meet his sovereign gaze. Arthur Sterling did not seem offended. If anything, a shadow of respect flickered across the hard planes of his face. He looked at the thin fabric of her shawl, then at the way her hand gripped the estate ledger, as if it were a shield or a holy relic. The contrast was stark. His wealth was a fortress, her poverty a battlefield. Yet she stood her ground, refusing to break the heavy stillness that had descended upon the yard. "Is this the hospitality of the North, then?" the Duke finally said, his voice a low baritone that carried the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Or do you find the sight of a stranger so unremarkable that it does not merit a greeting?" There was no cruelty in the question, only a dry, aristocratic curiosity. Marianne tightened her grip on the leather-bound ledger. "Thorne Farm has seen many strangers lately." "Your Grace," she replied, her voice even and clipped, stripped of the subservient lilt the local gentry expected. "Most come with papers and threats. You come with a gilded carriage and silk hose that are currently being ruined by my pig's breakfast. I wonder which is the greater omen of disaster." A faint twitch appeared at the corner of the Duke's mouth. Not a smile, but an acknowledgement of a hit. "You have a sharp tongue, Mrs. Thorne," he observed, stepping an inch closer. "It is a dangerous tool for a woman in your position. The local magistrate speaks of debts and insolvency. He speaks of a farm that has outlived its usefulness, and a woman who does not know when to surrender. Are his numbers accurate?" He was testing her, his grey eyes probing for a crack in her armor, waiting for her dignity to crumble into the pleading of the dispossessed. Marianne felt a simmering indignation rise within her, a warmth that countered the biting late autumn chill. "The numbers in the magistrate's books are a fiction created by a man who desires what he has not earned," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "A ledger is the one honest room in the world, and mine tells a different story. I have worked this land until my bones ache. I have kept this house breathing when every wind tried to extinguish its light. So tell me, sir, for I care little for your title if it brings no truth, have you come here to buy the land under my feet, or have you simply come to watch it die?" Arthur Sterling's expression shifted, the stone of his countenance cracking to reveal a glimpse of the wounded man beneath. He did not answer directly. Instead, he looked past her toward the old, sagging stable at the edge of the yard, his eyes narrowing as if he were looking at a ghost. "The land does not die so easily when it is fed with such ferocity," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He turned back to Marianne, the intensity of his gaze now tempered by a strange, melancholic gravity. "I did not come here to watch anything die, Marianne Thorne. I came to see if the world had succeeded in breaking the only thing in this valley that was ever truly worth saving." The use of her name, spoken with such a peculiar, haunting familiarity, sent a jolt of bewilderment through her. She searched his face for the source of that cadence, but the Duke's features had returned to their frozen mask. He was a figure of immense power standing in the middle of her ruin, yet a bridge was forming between them, a bridge built of silence, the scent of wet earth, and ancient, unspoken debts. Marianne felt the house behind her holding its breath, the very stones waiting for the next word to fall. The man before her was no longer a stranger from London. He was a question she did not yet know how to answer. With a sharp, decisive nod, Arthur Sterling gestured toward the cottage door, his intention clear. The door groaned upon its hinges as Arthur Sterling stepped across the threshold, his broad shoulders momentarily blocking the weak light of the afternoon that struggled to follow him into the cottage. He did not speak immediately. He was a man who preferred to understand the architecture of a space before he sought to command it. The air inside was thin and carried the sharp, metallic scent of cold stone, mingled with the lingering dampness of a hearth that had long forgotten the comforting roar of a proper fire. It was a poverty that did not scream for attention, but rather whispered its presence through a scrupulous, heart-breaking sort of order. A quiet desperation that kept its floors swept clean even as the larder went bare, enduring countless sparse meals. It was a humble piece of furniture, yet, to the man who now possessed the power of a dukedom, It held more weight than the gilded thrones of London. Arthur moved toward it, his polished leather boots clicking softly against the uneven hand-hewn floorboards. He reached out a gloved hand, his long fingers tracing the deep, familiar grain of the wood near the edge where the light caught, the fine dust motes dancing in the air. There, on that very corner, he had once sat as a shivering boy of 12, his knuckles raw and bleeding from the frost, and his stomach a hollow, aching cavern of hunger. He remembered the exact feel of this wood beneath his palms. It had been rougher then, perhaps, but the geometry of the room was etched into his soul like a map to a sanctuary. Near the center of the table lay the estate ledger, a heavy book bound in frayed, ink-stained leather. It was a starkly professional object to find in such a meager setting, yet it spoke of a mind that refused to let the chaos of misfortune dictate the internal order of the house. Arthur noted the meticulousness of the entries, the handwriting steady and precise, despite the cold that must have numbed the fingers of the woman who wrote them. The house was holding its breath, a silent witness to the return of a ghost who wore the coat of a lord. Marianne Thorne stood by the unlit hearth, her spine as straight as a soldier's in an old, threadbare gown that had been mended until the original fabric was a mere suggestion. She did not look at him with the fawning terror or the practiced humility he had come to expect from the tenantry since his elevation. Instead, her eyes held a steady, questioning light, a look that sought to measure the man beneath the velvet and fine wool of his traveling cloak. Arthur watched her in silence, his internal monologue a slow, rhythmic inventory of memories he had suppressed for a decade. He saw the way the years had etched fine lines around her eyes, lines born of sun, soil, and a sorrow that had been worn like weather. And he realized with a jarring clarity that the essence of her had not changed at all. The familiarity of her kindness was not something that could be captured in a portrait or quantified by a title. It was found in the very rhythm of her movements. Even now, as she stood under the scrutiny of a duke, she unconsciously reached down to brush a stray, imagined crumb of flour from her apron, a repetitive, rhythmic gesture that sent a sharp jolt of recognition through Arthur's chest. He had seen her do that 1,000 times during the bitter winter of 1805, her hands always moving, always tending to some small duty, even when the world outside offered nothing but stones. To her, he had not been a scantling or a beggar to be discarded, but a soul worthy of the last portion of her bread. He felt a surge of simmering indignation on her behalf, an iron-hard anger at the circumstances that had brought a woman of such integrity to this state of precarious survival. He was the Duke of Ashbourne now, a man defined by his restraint and the heavy, silent grief he had carried for 7 years. But in this room, he was merely the boy who remembered the smell of rye and caraway. He observed the way she tilted her head, a gesture of quiet defiance that suggested she would rather face eviction than the pity of a stranger. Arthur looked at the estate ledger once more, seeing the arithmetic of her survival laid bare in ink. She had managed the farm with a competence that put his own stewards to shame, accounting for every grain of wheat and every hour of labor, while the local magistrate sought to bleed her dry. Being seen by the right person was not the danger she perceived it to be. It was the only safety worth the name, though she could not yet know that the man standing in her kitchen was the very person who would ensure her vindication. He noticed her fingers were stained with ink, just as his were often stained by the endless paperwork of his duties. They shared a language of logic and labor, a bond formed in the shadow of hardship that the vanity of the world could never understand. The silence between them was thick, weighted with the unspoken history of the boy he had been and the man he had become. Arthur realized that his return was not merely an act of charity, but a restoration of the balance of the world. A ledger is the one honest room in the world, and his own internal account was heavily in her debt. He watched her breathe, noting the slight tremor in her hands that she fought so valiantly to master. He carried the heavy burden of unhealed wounds, but as he looked at Marianne, he felt the first stirrings of a thaw, a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth and everything to do with the memory of a woman who had once fed a starving boy when the rest of the world had turned its back. He knew then that he would not leave this farm until the accounts were settled and the woman who had saved him was finally, undeniably safe. Eliza Halloway returned to Thorne Farm not as a guest, but as a bearer of small, desperate mercies. She carried a wicker basket of windfalls, bruised apples that the winter had not yet claimed, and her own anxiety, which she wore like a second shawl. The sight that met her at the bend of the lane, however, caused the rhythm of her heart to falter and her breath to catch in a throat already tight with the morning's chill. The gilded carriage sat in the center of the muddy yard, an impossible, gleaming vessel of black lacquer and gold leaf that seemed to draw all the light from the grey autumn sky. It was a jewel dropped in a gutter, a symbol of a world that usually only touched their lives through the sharp edge of a tax collector's quill or the cold finality of an eviction notice. Eliza did not merely stop, she froze, the math of her world, the simple, brutal arithmetic of tenant and lord, shattering under the weight of such an intrusion. As she rounded the corner of the barn, the basket slipped from her numb fingers. The sound was a dull, wet thud against the damp earth, and the bruised apples scattered like lost, dull coins across the muck. Marianne Thorne stood by the carriage door, her spine a straight line of defiance against the wind, and beside her was a man who seemed to be carved from the very granite of the surrounding hills. Arthur Sterling did not wait for a servant to attend to the fallen fruit. He did not signal for a footman to bridge the social chasm between his station and the woman in the mud. Instead, he turned, his heavy wool greatcoat swirling about his polished boots, and moved with a grace that was entirely foreign to the uneven ground of a tenant farm. He stooped, a duke of the realm descending to the level of a peasant's windfall, and retrieved a single mottled apple from a puddle of standing water. The silence that followed was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down upon Eliza's shoulders as she watched the stranger. He did not sneer at the fruit's imperfection, nor did he wipe his fingers with a handkerchief of fine silk after touching the grime. He stood, tall and imposing, and held the apple out to the trembling neighbor with a steady hand. His grey eyes, the color of a sky that has not yet decided whether to clear or to storm, remained fixed on the woman's face until she reached out to take it. In that small, quiet gesture, the Duke rejected the hierarchy that Magistrate Finch used as a weapon. He was not a title standing in a yard. He was a man acknowledging the existence of another human being, in a world that usually rendered them invisible. Eliza whispered a broken word of thanks, her eyes darting to Marianne, who remained as still as a statue, her ink-stained fingers curled tightly into the wool of her shawl. The movement from the mud-spattered yard to the interior of the cottage was a transition of temperature and truth. The smell of damp slate and wet horses followed them over the threshold, but the kitchen did not offer the warmth a guest of such rank might expect. It was a room that had long since learned to hold its breath, waiting for a fire that never quite reached the corners of the stone floor. Arthur Sterling walked into the center of the space and stopped, his presence an inkblot on the pale, scrubbed surfaces of Marianne's life. He looked at the empty bread crock, the dry hearth, and the meticulous estate ledger resting on the scarred oak table, the only honest room in a world of lies. He did not look like a man assessing property. He looked like a man recognizing the architecture of a struggle he had once known in his own bones. He did not speak of the land's yield or the debts that Finch claimed were unpaid. Instead, the Duke stepped toward the small larder, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were navigating the geography of a ghost story. He turned back to Marianne, his face shadowed by the low rafters of the ceiling. The winter of 1805 was a cruel master, was it not? He said, his voice a low resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very timber of the house. A night when the ice was so thick on the stable walls that the horses' breath turned to frost before it could leave their muzzles. Marianne felt the air in the kitchen grow thick, the boundaries of the present day blurring into a memory she had kept buried beneath a decade of hard labor and quiet grief. She looked at his hands, calloused, despite the fine rings he wore, and felt a sudden, sharp prick of recognition that she could not yet name. I remember a woman who did not ask for a name or a history, he continued, his gaze never wavering from hers. I remember a half loaf of rye and caraway bread, still warm from a hearth that was much kinder then than it is today. The mention of the specific seed, the caraway that her husband had once insisted they could not afford to waste, was a strike of lightning in the cold room. Marianne's breath hitched, her mind racing through the ledgers of her past, searching for the face of the boy she had found shivering in her barn so many years ago. He stepped closer, until the scent of bergamot and expensive leather mingled with the faint, lingering smell of the wood smoke that clung to her clothes. "Do you still bake with caraway, Marianne?" he whispered, and the sound of her Christian name, stripped of its formal armor and spoken with such intimate weight, caused the house to finally exhale. The quiet no longer felt like a predatory beast. It was a bridge now, spanning the 10 winters that lay between a stable boy's hunger and a duke's return. Marianne looked up at him, her eyes searching the hard, aristocratic lines of his face for the hollow-cheeked scantling she had once protected. She saw the same storm-grey eyes, but the hunger in them now was not for bread. It was for the recognition of a soul that had remained unchanged by the weight of a crown. Arthur Sterling stood before her, a Titan cloaked in quiet grief, waiting for the one woman in England who had looked at him and seen a person instead of a grave. The pivotal question hung in the air, a test of memory that proved numbers were not the only thing that had to balance in the end. Being seen by the right person was not the danger she had feared. It was the only safety she had ever truly known. The memory arrived not as a gentle thought, but as a violent intrusion of frost and hunger, pulling Marianne Thorne back across a decade of silence. It was the winter of 1805, a season so brutal the birds fell dead from the oaks, and the very stones of the farm seemed to crack under the pressure of the ice. The air in the valley had been like whetted steel, cutting into the lungs of anyone foolish enough to draw a deep breath. Marianne had been 20 then, her spirit already tempered by the early loss of her mother and the burgeoning responsibilities of a household that never quite saw enough grain in the larder. She had gone to the stables late that evening, seeking a lost trowel, when she saw a shadow that did not belong to the horses. He was tucked into the furthest corner of the hayloft, a creature of mud and misery who looked less like a boy and more like a collection of sharp angles and shivering limbs. Scantling, they called him. The nameless orphan the head groom had hired for a pittance to muck out the stalls. He was so thin his ribs looked like the hull of a wrecked ship, and his eyes, wide and terrified in the gloom, were the color of a winter sea. He had been trying to sleep in a nest of damp straw, his coat so thin it offered no more protection than a cobweb against the biting draught. He did not beg when she found him. He simply watched her with a resignation that was far more painful to behold than any plea for mercy. Marianne had not spoken then. She had disappeared into the darkness of the main house and returned 10 minutes later with something tucked beneath her shawl. It was a half-loaf of rye and caraway loaf, still holding a faint, residual warmth from the morning's baking. The scent of the caraway seeds, sharp and earthy, filled the small space of the hayloft, acting as a bridge between her comfort and his wretchedness. She sat on the edge of the straw, her own fingers numbed by the cold, and broke the bread in two. Without hesitation, she handed the larger portion to the boy, whose hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the offering. "A man who works the stables should not have to eat the wind," she said softly, her voice steady despite the howl of the gale outside. It was a simple truth, delivered with the gravity one might afford a prince. At that moment, she did not see a beggar or a servant. She saw a soul in need of a tether to the world of the living. She watched him tear into the crust with a desperate, animal hunger, the caraway seeds spilling into the straw like tiny, forgotten promises. She stayed with him until the bread was gone, teaching him, perhaps for the first time in his short, brutal life, that to speak to a nobody as though he were a king was the only true measure of a person's worth. The memory dissolved, leaving the sharp, lingering scent of caraway in the air of the present day. Marianne Thorne stood in her kitchen, her hand trembling as it rested on the scarred wooden table, staring at the man who now occupied the space where her husband used to sit. The Duke of Ashbourne, Arthur Sterling, was no longer a collection of sharp angles. He was a mountain of fine wool and cold authority, a man whose presence seemed to command the very shadows of the room to retreat. Yet, as he looked at her, the icy grey of his eyes softened into a hue she recognized. The color of a winter sea that had finally found the shore. Arthur Sterling rose from the chair, the movement fluid and silent, carrying with him the terrifying weight of his station. He did not move toward her with the arrogance of a landlord, but with a strange, hesitant reverence. The hushed atmosphere in the kitchen felt feral. It gnawed at the air, thick with the unsaid and the impossible. biting at the edges of her composure until she felt she might shatter like glass. He stopped just inches from her, the scent of bergamot and expensive leather replacing the phantom smell of the hayloft. He leaned down, his face close enough that she could see the fine lines of grief etched around his mouth, the mark of a deep, unhealed wound. "Do you remember me now?" the Duke whispered, the words so low they seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. The question was not a demand for recognition. It was an invitation to look past the velvet and the title, back to the straw and the cold. Marianne looked into his face, searching for the boy she had fed, but the years had been a thorough sculptor. He was a stranger with a familiar soul, a ghost who had returned in the guise of a conqueror. She shook her head, her breath hitching in her throat, the sheer impossibility of the truth threatening to overwhelm her reason. Instead of answering with words, Arthur reached out and grasped the cuff of his charcoal grey coat. With a deliberate, slow motion, he unbuttoned the fine silk of his shirt and pulled the sleeve back to reveal his forearm. There, marring the pale, strong skin, was a jagged, silvered scar, 3 distinct prongs where a stable fork had once pierced the flesh during a moment of clumsy exhaustion 10 years prior. It was a mark of labor and pain, the only thing his immense wealth and grand title could never erase. It was the signature of the boy who had once eaten rye bread in the dark. The sight of the scar acted as the final key to a lock she had not known existed. The Duke was the scantling, the orphan who had disappeared into the night, after the Thor of 1805 had returned as the master of the very land she stood upon. He was the debt collector who had come not to seize her farm, but to pay for a half loaf of bread with the gold of his protection. Marianne felt the world tilt on its axis, the hierarchy of her life collapsing into the simple reality of 2 people standing in a quiet room, bound by a kindness that had refused to die. Arthur watched her, his expression one of profound vulnerability, waiting to see if the woman who had saved the boy would accept the man he had become. Marianne Thorne did not move. She did not gasp, nor did she allow the strength in her knees to fail her, though the world outside the small, distorted window of her kitchen seemed to tilt on its axis. The whisper hung in the air between them, heavier than the oak beams above their heads, and more ancient than the stone walls that had sheltered her through her widowhood. She looked at him, really looked at him, stripping away the fine, tailored lines of his dark coat, the crisp linen of his cravat, and the terrifying weight of his ducal authority. Beneath the polished veneer of the man who could end her life with a stroke of a pen, she searched for the ghost of the boy who had once sought refuge in her barn. It was in the eyes. They were the cool, unforgiving grey of a sky that had not yet decided whether to bring snow or rain, a shade she had seen mirrored in a shivering, hollow-cheeked child 10 winters ago. The structure of his jaw was the same, though now it was set with the hardness of granite rather than the fragility of starvation. Recognition did not arrive as a thunderclap, it came as the slow, painful thawing of a limb that had been frozen for too long. It was a dull ache at first, then a stinging heat that rose into her throat. She remembered the way he had looked at the bread, not with the greed of a thief, but with the reverence of a dying man witnessing a miracle. She did not bow. To bow now would have been to acknowledge the chasm that society had dug between them, and in this moment, the ledger of their lives was being balanced by a much older law than that of the peerage. Instead, Marianne reached out. Her hand, stained with the ink of her farm accounts and calloused by years of pulling life from the stubborn Derbyshire soil, trembled only slightly as she touched the sleeve of his coat. The wool was fine, impossibly soft beneath her fingertips, the kind of material that felt like a mockery of the rough burlap the boy had worn. She needed to know he was made of flesh and bone, that he was not merely a phantom conjured by her own exhaustion and the looming shadow of eviction. Arthur Sterling did not flinch. He remained as still as a statue in a cathedral. His gaze locked upon her face with an intensity that seemed to count every line of worry and every shadow of grief she had acquired in his absence. When her fingers brushed the expensive cloth of his sleeve, a sharp, ragged breath escaped him, the first crack in his formidable aristocratic mask. He looked down at her small, weathered hand against his dark sleeve, and for a fleeting second, the Duke of Ashbourne vanished. In his place stood the scantling, the nameless stable boy who had once known nothing but the biting wind and the unexpected mercy of a woman's hand. Marianne finally found her voice, though it was little more than a rasping echo of its usual steady tone. She called him by the name she had given him when he was a vagabond with no history, a word that felt like a sacrilege in the presence of his gilded carriage. Scantling, she breathed, the syllable catching on the jagged edges of her disbelief. It was a name for a scrap of a human being, a thing of no consequence. Yet as it left her lips, the man before her closed his eyes, his shoulders dropping as if he had been carrying the weight of the entire firmament and had finally been allowed to set it down. He did not answer immediately. He seemed to be cataloguing the sensory details of the room. The scent of wood smoke, the lingering aroma of the rye and caraway loaf she had been preparing, and the ticking of the clock that measured the seconds of her impending ruin. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer the clipped, commanding tone of a peer of the realm. It was low, resonant, and suffused with a melancholic gravity that made her heart ache. Arthur explained the impossible, the chaotic sequence of deaths that had turned a stable boy into a duke. He spoke of 7 cousins lost to fever and the sea, of an elderly grandfather who had spent his final years in a desperate, late-blooming search for a missing heir he had never deigned to acknowledge during his life. The inheritance had not been a gift, he told her, his grey eyes darkening with the memory of his transition. It had been a violent uprooting. He had been found working in a shipyard in Bristol, his hands bloodied by labour and his stomach half empty, only to be told he was the master of thousands of acres and the keeper of a name that stretched back to the conquest. He described the years that followed as a period of stifling isolation, where he had been forced to learn the languages of the dead and the intricacies of the law, all while the ghost of the boy he had been shivered in the corners of his vast empty ballrooms. "I have spent these years as a sorrow wearing a man's coat, Marianne," he whispered, using her name with a familiarity that should have been scandalous, but felt instead like the only honest thing in the world. The title was a cumbersome garment, a heavy velvet shroud that muffled the heart beneath it. I did not want the gold, nor the land, nor the power to make men tremble. I wanted only the means to find the person who had looked at a beggar and seen a human being. He looked toward the estate ledger, resting on the scarred wooden table, the book that held the evidence of her struggle and her competence, and his expression softened into something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. The gilded carriage, waiting in the mud outside, was a symbol of his transformation, but here, in the dim light of her kitchen, Arthur Sterling made it clear that he viewed his wealth only as a currency of memory. He had endured the lessons, the ridicule of the ton, and the crushing loneliness of his new station for one purpose. He had hunted for her across 3 counties, following the trail of a soul who had once shared her last bit of bread with a boy who had nothing to offer in return. The debt he carried was not one that could be found in any of her carefully kept books. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the floorboards, Marianne realized that the man who had come to survey her farm was not there to judge her solvency, but to ensure that the hand that had once fed him would never go hungry again. The silence in the kitchen was no longer the hollow, biting chill of neglect. It had become a dense, expectant thing, a weight that pressed against the walls until the old timber seemed to groan in protest. Arthur Sterling stood in the center of the small room, his presence so vast and commanding that the low ceiling appeared to stoop to meet him. He did not look like a man of leisure or a creature of the London ballrooms. He looked like a mountain that had decided to walk, a figure carved from the very granite of the northern peaks, draped in the finest wool that money could procure. His grey eyes, the color of a winter sky just before the first snow falls, remained fixed upon Marianne Thorne with an intensity that made the breath hitch in her throat. She stood by the hearth, her hands instinctively clutching the edges of her threadbare shawl, her back as rigid and uncompromising as an iron fire poker. Arthur moved then, a slow and deliberate shift that carried the weight of a decade of intention. He stepped toward the scrubbed oak table, the same table where, 10 winters ago, a desperate boy had watched a young woman slice into her last hope of a meal. From the pocket of his embroidered waistcoat, he produced a single gold coin. It was a heavy thing, a sovereign that caught the meager light filtering through the grime-streaked window and turned it into a brilliant, accusing spark. He did not toss it. He placed it precisely on the spot where the rye and caraway loaf had once rested. The sound of the metal meeting the wood was sharp, a punctuation mark in the long, rambling sentence of their shared history. "I am the payment, Marianne," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel through the floorboards and into the soles of her boots. "I am the payment for a debt you never called in, for a mercy you granted when you had nothing but mercy to give. You fed a ghost that winter. And the ghost has spent 10 years learning how to become a man worthy of your bread." He did not reach for her. He understood, with the keen intuition of a man who had once owned nothing, that a woman like Marianne Thorne could not be bought with gold, nor could she be seduced by sudden providence. He was offering her more than wealth. He was offering her the closure of a moral ledger that had remained unbalanced for too long. He had worn his grief like weather for 7 years. But this recognition, was the first break in the clouds he had allowed himself to feel. Marianne looked down at the coin, her eyes tracing the glint of the gold against the grey, weathered grain of the wood. The sovereign looked alien there, a piece of a world she had only ever seen from the roadside as carriages thundered past. It represented the end of her fear, the end of the magistrate's threats, and the salvation of the only home she had ever known. Yet she felt a strange, cold resistance blooming in the center of her chest. She looked at Arthur, seeing not just the Duke of Ashbourne, but the shadow of the boy who had shivered in her barn. She saw the lines of sorrow around his mouth, the hardness in his jaw that spoke of a different kind of hunger. A hunger for justice, perhaps, or for the peace that comes with a debt settled. Instead of reaching for the coin, Marianne stepped toward the small desk in the corner where the estate ledger lay open. It was a battered book, its leather cover scarred by water and heat, its pages filled with her own meticulous, ink-stained handwriting. For years, this book had been the one honest room in the world, the only place where her labor was seen, and her sacrifices were counted to the final penny. She placed her hand upon it, her fingers rough and calloused, the skin cracked from years of handling damp soil and frozen laundry. Her hands were the maps of her survival, and she was not yet ready to have those maps erased by a miracle she had not earned. "Your Grace," she began, the title feeling like a stone in her mouth, "you speak of debts and payments as if life were a simple sum of addition and subtraction. You see a woman in a cold house and wish to build a fire, and for that I should be grateful. But these calluses on my palms, they are mine. The struggle that has kept this farm solvent, despite the magistrate's greed and the winter's cruelty, is the only thing I truly own. To have it simply paid away, to have my burden lifted by a man who remembers a half loaf of bread from a decade ago. It feels like a theft of a different kind." She looked him full in the face, her gaze unblinking. "I have earned my grief, Arthur. I have earned the right to stand on this land because I have bled into its furrows. I do not want a miracle that makes my 10 years of labor irrelevant." The Duke did not flinch at her words. He seemed to absorb them, his expression shifting from a determined resolve to a profound, quiet respect. He looked at her ink-stained fingers, then back to her eyes, seeing the intellectual parity she demanded. He realized then that he could not save her the way a lord saves a tenant. He had to meet her as a partner in the governance of her own life. The heavy quiet proved unexpectedly sharp, cutting into the assumptions he had brought with him in his gilded carriage. He had come to bestow a blessing, but he found himself standing before a woman who required a witness instead. "Marianne Thorne," he said, his voice regaining its stately cadence, but softened by a genuine vulnerability. "I do not wish to erase your struggle. I wish to give it the victory it deserves. The magistrate believes you are a woman of no consequence, a ledger that can be closed and discarded. I am here to ensure that your name is written in the stone of this county so deeply that no one, not Finch nor time itself, will ever be able to strike it out. You fed a boy who had no name. Let that boy, who now has a title and the law behind him, stand as the shield for the woman who has been her own sword for far too long." He moved no closer, respecting the boundary she had drawn with her pride. But the air between them throbbed with the weight of a promise that was no longer about bread, but about the very architecture of their souls. She watched him, her hand still resting on the ledger, the cold coin still shimmering on the table. She saw the bruised soul beneath the aristocratic veneer, and for the first time since the carriage had arrived, she allowed herself to believe that tears were not forever. The house was holding its breath, waiting for her answer, waiting to see if the winter would finally break, or if the ice would hold for another decade. Marianne Thorne did not move, but the ink on her fingers felt a little less like a stain and a little more like a signature of the future. Arthur Sterling sat at the small, scarred kitchen table, his presence rendering the modest room suddenly cramped and insufficient. The estate ledger lay open between them, its pages yellowed by the damp of 100 storms and the heavy humidity of Marianne Thorne's tears. He did not look like a man who had ever known hunger, yet the way his long, elegant fingers traced the columns of numbers suggested a familiarity with the arithmetic of survival. He was no longer the shivering boy she had sheltered in the hayloft, but the Duke of Ashbourne, a man whose signature could move mountains or ruin lives with a single stroke of a pen. Marianne stood by the hearth, her posture unbending, despite the threadbare shawl that offered little protection against the evening's encroaching chill. She watched him work. It was an intellectual spar played out in the silence of a cold kitchen, a ledger acting as the only honest room in a world built on deception. Arthur did not speak for several minutes, his gaze intense as he scrutinized the entries for the last 3 harvests. The candlelight flickered, casting long, predatory shadows against the lime-washed walls, but he remained as still as a statue carved from granite. His grey eyes, typically as cool and unreadable as a sky that has not decided whether to clear, began to darken, becoming the color of a storm finally clearing its path for a strike of lightning. He reached the bottom of a page where the hand of Magistrate Finch had scrawled a series of late payment penalties. The ink was aggressive, the handwriting of a man who enjoyed the weight of his own thumb on the scales of justice. Arthur's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek as he performed the scrupulous calculation of a decade's worth of systematic theft. Every pound that had been bled from this farm, every bushel of grain that had been diverted into Finch's private granaries, was now laid bare before the man who owned the very air the magistrate breathed. Arthur looked up, and for a moment, the aristocratic facade vanished. In its place was a simmering indignation, a righteous fury that had been 10 years in the making. He saw the systematic cruelty not as a series of financial discrepancies, but as the exact number of loaves of bread that Bartholomew Finch had stolen from this woman's table. The hushed room felt menacing, biting into the Duke's restraint as he realized the magnitude of the betrayal. He closed the ledger with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet house. Marianne did not flinch. She had worn her grief like weather for 7 years, and she was well acquainted with the sound of things breaking. But this was different. This was the sound of a trap being set for a predator. Arthur stood, his silhouette dominating the room, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath as he moved toward her. He did not reach for her hand, for he understood the propriety of her silence and the boundaries of her pride. Instead, he stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes searching hers for the ghost of the girl who had once shared her rye and caraway loaf with a beggar. The transition from the cold, clinical audit of the ledger to the raw, human recognition between them was as sharp as a winter frost. He saw the ink-stained fingers of a widow who had fought to remain solvent in a world that wanted her destitute, and his heart, so long encased in a fortress of silent suffering, began to thaw. The atmosphere in the cottage shifted, the tension of the impending legal battle, giving way to a stillness that was almost sacred. Arthur looked at the hearth, which remained cold despite the late hour, and his voice when he spoke was gravelly and low. He asked her for a cup of water, a request so humble it seemed out of place, coming from a man who travelled in a gilded carriage. Marianne moved with the practiced grace of someone who had spent a lifetime serving others, her movements devoid of the frantic energy that usually accompanied the presence of the gentry. She retrieved a ceramic vessel from the shelf, a relic of better times that was now marred by a significant chip along its rim. It was a humble thing, a vessel of clay that had survived the passage of years just as she had. She filled it from the pail and handed it to him, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest of seconds. In that contact, the years of separation seemed to collapse. He took the cup from her with a reverence that suggested he held a chalice of fine crystal, ignoring the jagged edge that pressed against his thumb. He drank slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. The water was cold, tasting of the deep earth and the limestone of the valley, and to Arthur, it was more reviving than the finest claret in the Ashbourne cellars. He placed the cup on the table and looked at her, the mask of the Duke slipping further to reveal the boy, who had once prayed for a single kind word. He saw the fatigue in the corners of her eyes and the way she braced herself against the table, as if she expected the floor to fall away beneath her feet at any moment. He told her then that the dawn would bring more than just the light. He spoke of the restitution that was owed, not just in coin, but in the restoration of her dignity. He urged her to trust him one more time, his words carrying the weight of a solemn oath. The magistrate would come with the morning tide, armed with papers of eviction and a heart of flint, but he would find a wall of iron waiting for him. Arthur's promise was not the empty platitude of a nobleman, but the vow of a man who understood that tears are not forever. Marianne felt a strange, fluttering hope stir in her chest, a sensation she had buried so deeply she had forgotten its name. She looked at the Duke, seeing the strength in his shoulders and the ancient, quiet loyalty in his gaze. She had fed a boy who had nothing, and now that boy had returned as a man who possessed everything. Yet he was asking for her permission to protect her. It was a partnership born in the mud of a stable yard and forged in the fire of a shared memory, a bond that the laws of men could not easily break. As he prepared to leave for the night, intending to stay at the village inn to maintain a semblance of propriety before the public confrontation, he stopped at the threshold. The smell of the damp earth and the coming rain blew in through the open door, mingling with the scent of old paper and the lingering memory of Caraway. He looked back at her once more, his silhouette framed by the silver light of a rising moon. He did not offer words of romance, for they were too fragile for the weight of their history. Instead, he offered her a future where she would never again have to count the grains of salt in her cupboard. The house was still holding its breath, but the air no longer felt stagnant. It felt like the moments before a great gale, the kind that clears the dead wood from the forest and prepares the soil for a new season. Arthur disappeared into the darkness, the sound of his footsteps retreating toward the waiting carriage, leaving Marianne alone in the quiet kitchen. She looked down at the ledger, then at the chipped cup he had used, and for the first time in 7 years, she allowed herself to believe that the ledger of her life might finally find its balance. The sound of the eviction squad arrived before the men did, a rhythmic, metallic clatter of carriage wheels, and the heavy, uncoordinated thud of boots upon the saturated earth of the yard. It was a sound that lacked the elegance of a gentleman's arrival. It was the noise of a machine designed to grind the weak into the silt of history. Marianne Thorne stood by the hearth, her spine a straight line of defiance against the encroaching cold. She had placed the estate ledger upon the scarred oak table, its ink-stained pages a testament to a decade of survival that no man in the county had seen fit to acknowledge. The house, which had stood for generations against the tempests of the moors, seemed to hunker down, its timbers groaning as though it were bracing for a final, fatal blow. Magistrate Finch did not knock. He entered the kitchen with the proprietary air of a man who believed that ownership was a matter of volume and violence rather than law or labor. He was a man of soft edges and hard intentions, his face a map of petty indulgences and a soul that had long ago calculated the price of every neighbor's misery. As he stepped across the threshold, his boots carried the filth of the pig run onto her clean floor, a deliberate act of desecration intended to signal her loss of status. Behind him, 2 men of low character lingered in the doorway, their presence a shadow that made the small, orderly room feel like a cage. Finch paused, his nostrils flared in a parody of a refined gentleman sampling a vintage. He sniffed the air, a sneer curling his lip with visible satisfaction. The scent of the spiced bread lingered, the small, warm ghost of the bread Marianne had baked that morning. "The smell of poverty is quite distinctive, is it not?" he remarked, his voice like the grinding of dry stone. "That wretched caraway, it is the scent of a beggar's last meal, Marianne, a peasant's spice, used to hide the rot of the grain. Much like this ledger hides the rot of your husband's debts. It is an insult to the propriety of the parish that you still draw breath under this roof." He reached out a gloved hand. The leather was a sickly yellow and smelled of cheap tallow, and pushed the estate ledger toward the edge of the table. Marianne did not flinch, though the movement felt like a strike against her very heart. She watched the book teeter, her fingers gripping the edge of her threadbare shawl. "The accounts are solvent, sir," she said, her voice even and cool, a stark contrast to his simmering malevolence. "If you would but look at the arithmetic, you would see that the Thorne farm has paid its tithes and its taxes. There is no legal ground for an eviction, nor for this intrusion. Arithmetic is for those who have something to count." Finch laughed, a sound like breaking glass in a quiet chapel. "I have the law, and the law says you are a widow in a house that belongs to a duke who has no time for the insignificant. You are a debt to be cleared, a smudge on the map of the Ashbourne estate. Men, begin the removal. Start with the furniture. It is not much, but it will fetch enough to pay for the ink I waste on your notices." The men moved forward, their shadows stretching across the floor like long, grasping fingers, but the movement stopped. Not because of Marianne's resistance, but because of a sudden, unnatural silence that descended upon the farmyard outside. The abrupt quiet felt like a beast baring its fangs. Arthur Sterling stepped from the shadows of the cottage porch, his presence a sudden and total eclipse of Finch's authority. He had been listening, a silent observer of the magistrate's petty cruelty, and now he moved with the grace of a predator that had mastered the geometry of power. He did not shout. He did not need to. The sheer weight of his stillness was enough to bring the two henchmen to a stumbling halt. The Duke was a figure of absolute refinement, his greatcoat of charcoal wool catching the silver light of the overcast sky, his silver-topped cane striking the floor with the finality of a gavel. Beside him, Finch looked like a counterfeit coin, shabby, loud, and fundamentally worthless. Arthur did not look at the magistrate first, he looked at Marianne. His grey eyes, the colour of a storm that had finally decided where to strike, softened for a fleeting heartbeat before they turned back to the man in the doorway. "Magistrate Finch," Arthur said, the name delivered as though it were a piece of soiled linen he was forced to hold. The voice was low, resonant, and carried the unmistakable timbre of a leader who had commanded armies and governed estates. Finch blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, his arrogance replaced by a frantic, scrambling terror. He looked past the tall man to the gilded carriage that now loomed behind the barn, its crest visible even through the autumn mist. The crest of the Ashbourne dukedom. "Your Grace?" Finch stammered, his face draining of colour until it matched the parchment of the eviction notice in his hand. I was unaware of your presence in the county. I am merely conducting the business of the estate, a simple eviction. The woman is insolvent, a squatter truly. I was acting in your interest, sir." Arthur moved closer, his footsteps silent on the floorboards, creating a vacuum of authority that pulled the very air from Finch's lungs. He leaned in, forcing the magistrate to retreat, until the man's back hit the doorframe. The Duke spoke so softly that the men in the doorway had to strain to hear, but for Finch, the words were like claps of thunder. "You spoke of the smell of caraway, magistrate," Arthur whispered, his gaze pinning the man to the wood. "You called it the scent of a beggar. It is a scent I know well. It is the scent of the only mercy I found when the world, men like you, offered me nothing but stones and silence." He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Marianne's. In that small kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of her struggle, he looked at her with a recognition that spanned a decade of suffering. "Do you remember me now, Marianne?" he whispered. The question meant only for her, though it shattered the magistrate's world. He reached out and picked up the estate ledger, placing it firmly back in the center of the table. "You wish to talk of debts, Finch? We shall discuss them. We shall discuss every penny you have diverted from these books into your own pockets over the last 7 years. We shall discuss the price of a woman's dignity and the cost of threatening what belongs to me." Finch's knees buckled, and the papers he held fluttered to the floor, landing in the mud he had tracked into the house. The reversal was absolute. The hunter had become the prey, and the house, which had held its breath for so long, finally began to draw a ragged, disbelieving sigh of relief. The farmyard of the Thorne holding had become, quite suddenly, a courtroom of mud and cold air. The late autumn sky was the color of a bruised plum, pressing down upon the gathered villagers who had drifted toward the gates like leaves caught in a draught. They stood in a ragged semicircle, their breath blooming in white plumes, watching the impossible spectacle of the gilded carriage parked beside a manure pile. At the center of this ring of frozen expectation stood Arthur Sterling. He did not look like the boy who had once shivered in the hay. He looked like a monument carved from dark granite, his greatcoat catching the wind as if it were a sail of mourning. Beside him, Bartholomew Finch looked remarkably small. The magistrate had attempted to maintain his posture of local superiority, but the presence of the Duke was an atmospheric pressure that made the lungs of every man present labor with unaccustomed effort. Arthur held the estate ledger in his calloused hand. It was a heavy, leather-bound volume that contained the arithmetic of Marianne Thorne's life. But in the hands of the Duke, it had become a weapon. He looked at the gathered crowd, his grey eyes sweeping over them with the cold precision of a winter storm. He did not shout, he did not need to. His voice was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to carry the weight of the very earth they stood upon. He commanded Finch to step forward, and the magistrate obeyed with a jerky, unnatural motion, his face the color of spoiled cream. "Open the book," Arthur whispered. The command was softer than a breeze, yet it carried the finality of a gavel. He forced the ledger into the shaking hands of the man who had sought to destroy Marianne. "You will read," Arthur continued, his gaze never wavering. "You will read the entry for the winter of last year. Specifically, you will read the discrepancy between the grain recorded by the tenant and the grain reported to the Ashbourne estate office." The breathless hush in the yard carried a predatory edge. It bit into the pride of the man who had thought himself untouchable. Bartholomew Finch looked at the ink-stained pages, his eyes darting across the scrupulous columns Marianne had penned with such desperate care. His voice, when it finally emerged, was a thin, whistling thing. "5 pounds of rye," he stammered. He could not finish the sentence. Arthur stepped closer, his shadow falling over the magistrate like a mountain. "Read the rest," Arthur prompted. "Read the note in the margin, where you added interest upon a debt that had already been settled in full." The villagers shifted, a low murmur of indignation rising like the hum of a disturbed hive. Mrs. Halloway stepped forward, her hands twisting in her apron, her eyes wide with the realization that the demon of their valley was being unmade by a god of his own making. The Duke turned his back on the trembling magistrate, dismissing him as one might dismiss a persistent insect. He looked at the villagers, many of whom had looked away when Marianne had walked past them in her threadbare shawl. He saw their shame and he saw their fear. He knew that fear. It was the same cold weight he had carried in his belly when he was a nameless boy eating crusts in the dark. He did not judge them for it, for hunger is a cruel master that makes cowards of us all, but he intended to change the geography of their world. Before the sun touched the horizon, the light began to fail, turning the mud to the color of iron as the sun dipped behind the ancient oaks of the Ashbourne border. Arthur Sterling reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a document sealed with heavy, black wax. It was a deed of purchase, thick and authoritative. He did not address the crowd at first. He addressed Marianne, who stood by the door of her cottage with a dignity that made the surrounding poverty seem like a choice rather than a condition. She had not moved. She had watched the destruction of Finch with the same stoicism she had used to endure his threats. "Marianne," the Duke said, his voice softening just enough to let the humanity through the aristocratic ice. He gestured to the sprawling lands that stretched from the Thorne farm to the village steeple. "This morning, this land belonged to a man who valued coins over character. This afternoon, that man has been removed. I have purchased the entirety of the village, every acre of stone and every inch of thatch. It is no longer a holding of the Ashbourne fringe. It is mine." A collective gasp went up from the crowd, a sound like a sudden intake of breath from a drowning man. He walked toward her then, his boots sinking into the mud without a hint of hesitation. He stopped a few feet away, his presence filling the space between them with a heat that defied the biting wind. "You have managed this farm with a competence that puts the estate's own clerks to shame," he said, loud enough for every ear in the yard to catch. "Your ledger is the only honest room I have found in this county. Therefore I am naming you the steward of the entire village. You will manage the rents. You will oversee the grain. You will report to no one but me." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a world shifting on its axis. Mrs. Halloway let out a small, strangled sob of relief, and even the men who had once mocked Marianne's ink-stained fingers bowed their heads in a sudden, desperate reverence. The status reversal was so complete, so violent in its swiftness, that it felt like a physical blow. Marianne looked at the man before her, the man she had fed when he was a beggar, the man who was now handing her the keys to her world. She did not cry, she did not curtsy, she simply straightened her spine, her eyes meeting his grey gaze with the intellectual parity of an equal. She saw the boy in the Duke's eyes, and he saw the savior in hers. The house behind her, once cold and accused by the damp, seemed to settle into its foundations. It was no longer holding its breath. The debt of that humble meal had been calculated, balanced, and repaid in a currency that Finch and his kind could never understand. Arthur Sterling, the lord of the estate, did not need to raise his voice. "You have 1 hour to vacate your offices," Arthur said the granite, returning to his voice. "After that you are a trespasser on my land." He did not look at the man again. He looked at Marianne, and in that look the winter seemed to lose its power to kill. The late autumn sun hung low over the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the mud of the farmyard. It was a cold light, one that did not offer warmth but rather exposed the stark reality of the neglect that had plagued the Thorne farm for far too long. In the center of this desolate stage, Bartholomew Finch stood paralyzed, his breath coming in ragged, visible plumes. The arrogance that had served as his armor for years was now a shattered thing, falling away in jagged pieces before the absolute, crushing weight of the man standing before him. Arthur Sterling, now a peer of the realm, did not look like a man to be trifled with. His presence alone was a sentence from which there was no appeal. He stood with a stillness that was more terrifying than any display of rage. A broken spirit hidden in fine wool, perhaps, but one that had finally found its wings. The Duke extended a hand, the fine leather of his glove a sharp contrast to the grimy, trembling fingers of the man he addressed. His voice, when he spoke, was low and resonated with the cold clarity of a bell struck in the frost. He did not ask for the seal of office. He demanded it with the quiet certainty of a sovereign reclaiming stolen land. The magistrate reached into the pocket of his heavy coat, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, as if his limbs no longer recognized the commands of his mind. When the heavy brass seal finally emerged, it caught the dying light, a symbol of authority that had been twisted into a tool of petty tyranny. With a final, shuddering breath, Finch was forced to perform the one act he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He bowed. It was a deep, awkward movement that cost him more than gold. It cost him the entire fiction of his own superiority. He remained bent, his face turned toward the muck of the yard, as he pressed the seal into the Duke's waiting palm. The Duke did not look at the fallen man. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Marianne Thorne, who stood on the threshold of her cottage, with her posture rigidly upright. There was no triumph in her expression, only a profound, weary dignity that had survived every storm Finch had thrown her way. Arthur walked toward her, his boots sinking into the damp earth with a rhythm that felt like the closing of a ledger. When he reached her, he did not offer her a romantic gesture or a hollow compliment. He simply placed the heavy seal of the magistracy into her ink-stained hand. He knew, with the scrupulous intuition of someone who had lived both in the gutter and the palace, that power was only safe in the hands of those who had never hungered for it. Marianne felt the weight of the brass, cold and unyielding, against her palm. She looked down at the device, then back at the yard where the neighbors had gathered in the shadows, their faces pale and expectant. Her gaze found Mrs. Halloway, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and dawning hope. Without a word, Marianne turned and walked back into the cottage, the Duke following her in a respectful silence. She laid the estate ledger open upon the scarred wooden table, the pages filled with her meticulous, sloping script, the arithmetic of her survival. She did not hesitate. With a steady hand, she inked the seal and pressed it firmly onto the bottom of the page where the Halloway debt was recorded. The sound of the seal meeting the paper was sharp, a finality that echoed through the small room. She had used her first act of power not to enrich herself, but to sign a pardon for a neighbor who had nothing left to give. It was a moral victory that balanced a decade of cruelty, a quiet revolution of character over rank. As the evening deepened, the frantic energy of the confrontation outside began to dissipate, replaced by a stillness that was no longer heavy with dread. The gilded carriage remained in the yard, its lanterns flickering like low stars, but the focus had shifted inward, to the small kitchen that had seen so much cold and so little comfort. For the first time in 10 years, the hearth was truly roaring, the flames consuming the seasoned oak with a voracious, warming hunger. The smell of the wood smoke mingled with the lingering, earthy scent of the rain-dampened stone, creating a sanctuary that felt earned rather than merely occupied. The house, which had spent years holding its breath in anticipation of the next blow, finally seemed to exhale, its very bones settling into the heat of the fire. Arthur Sterling sat at the unornamented table, having discarded his heavy traveling cloak. He did not look like an aristocrat who had ever known the gnawing ache of an empty stomach, yet the man he had struggled to become was defined by his memories rather than his titles. Across from him sat Marianne, her hands resting on the table, no longer clutching a shawl or a ledger, but simply resting in the rare luxury of peace. Between them sat the remnants of a dark-seeded loaf, the bread a humble witness to the bridge they had built across a chasm of 10 years and 100 social ranks. They did not speak of the magistrate's banishment or the legal complexities of the estate. Such things were the business of the world, and the world had been locked outside the door. The silence in the kitchen was of a different quality now. It was not the hollow, biting silence of poverty, nor was it the sterile, echoing silence of a mausoleum. It was a living thing, soft and rhythmic, measured by the crackle of the fire and the slow, steady breathing of two people who had finally recognized each other in the dark. Arthur watched the way the firelight played across Marianne's face, tracing the lines of a resilience he had admired since he was a shivering boy in her stable. He saw the way she looked at the bread, not with the desperation of the hungry, but with the quiet satisfaction of the provider. Being seen by the right person was not the danger she had once feared. It was the only safety worth the name, a ledger that had finally, miraculously, found its balance. Outside, the first frost of the season began to bloom across the windows, turning the glass into a delicate silver lace, but inside, the warmth was absolute. The Duke reached out, his calloused fingers briefly covering Marianne's hand on the table. It was a gesture of profound respect. There was no need for the grand proclamations of the ballroom, or the flowery language of the court. The truth of their bond was written in the architecture of the soul, in the shared understanding that kindness once given created a debt that time could never erode. As the fire settled into a deep, glowing red, the house remained quiet, but it was a silence full of a future that neither of them would ever have to face alone again. In the small, warm room, the past was no longer a ghost to be feared, but a foundation upon which a new honest life could finally be built. The steam from the freshly baked rustic bread rose in a slow, fragrant plume, curling toward the darkened rafters of the kitchen, like a ghost finally finding its peace. It was a humble scent, earthy and sharp, cutting through the heavy smell of wood smoke and the lingering chill of the autumn evening. 10 years ago, that same scent had been a cruel taunt, a reminder of what was being lost as a boy, with hollow cheeks and frost-bitten fingers huddled in the shadows of a barn. Now it was a bridge. Marianne Thorne sat across from the man who had once been a shivering phantom in her memories, watching the way the firelight played across the sharp, noble angles of his face. Arthur Sterling, the Duke of Ashbourne, did not look like a man who had ever known the gnawing ache of an empty stomach, yet his grey eyes held a depth of recognition that no amount of silk or title could ever mask. He reached out, his large hands moving with a deliberate slowness as he broke the hot bread apart. There was no haste in his movements, no desperation of the sort that had once driven a child to eat rye husks from the dirt. He pulled the loaf into 2 uneven pieces, the steam billowing out to veil his expression for a fleeting second. Without a word, he pushed the larger half across the scrubbed wooden table toward Marianne. It was a silent mirror to a winter long past, a mathematical symmetry of the soul that required no explanation. 10 years ago, she had given a beggar the larger share of her only meal. Tonight, a duke returned the gesture with the gravity of a king bestowing a province. Marianne felt the heat of the bread through her palms, the texture of the grain, a grounding reality against the impossible events of the day. The silence between them was no longer a predator with teeth. It was a soft, breathing thing, a shared space where the weight of their separate griefs could finally be set down. She looked at the larger half of the bread, then up at the man who had worn his sorrow like weather for so long. He was not looking at her with the pity of a benefactor or the triumph of a conqueror. He was looking at her as if she were the only honest room in a world built of facades. In the golden glow of the hearth, the social chasm that should have separated a tenant widow from a peer of the realm seemed as thin as a single thread of flax. Arthur took a piece of his own bread, chewing slowly, his gaze never wavering from hers. There was a profound intimacy in the act, a communion that transcended the strictures of propriety and the ledgers of debt. He did not speak of the magistrate he had banished, or the deeds he had signed. Those were merely the mechanics of justice, the cold arithmetic of power. Here, in the warmth of the kitchen, they were discussing a different kind of solvency. They were acknowledging a bond forged in the mud and tempered by the passage of a decade. Marianne realized then that his return had not been about the restoration of a farm, but the restoration of a heart that had been frozen since the night he first tasted her kindness. By the time the moon had climbed high over the skeletal trees of the valley, the world outside Thorne Farm had grown still and silvered with frost. The gilded carriage stood in the yard, its polished lanterns glowing like misplaced stars in the muck of the farmstead. It was a magnificent, heavy thing, a symbol of the immense distance Arthur had traveled from the boy who slept in the straw. The horses tossed their heads, their harness bells chiming with a cold, metallic ring that seemed to urge the Duke back to the great house on the hill, back to the marble halls and the empty, echoing corridors of his status. Arthur stood by the open door of the cottage, his dark cloak swirling around his boots as he looked at the carriage, then back at Marianne, who stood in the threshold. He turned to the waiting footman, his voice low and clipped, carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who had mastered his own destiny. He gave the order to send the carriage back to the main estate, empty. He would not be whisked away in a box of velvet and gold, insulated from the earth he had fought so hard to reclaim. Instead, he stepped away from the gilded symbol of his rank and toward Marianne. The message was clear to any who might have been watching from the shadows of the village. He was not a visitor to this life, but a part of it. The partnership they had formed over the ruins of a broken ledger was not a temporary alliance of convenience, but a permanent union of two souls who had finally found their equilibrium. They walked together toward the rise of the hill, the damp earth of the fields yielding beneath their feet. To a casual observer, they might have looked like a master and a servant, or a landlord and a tenant, but the way they walked, shoulder to shoulder, their strides synchronized in the silver light, told a different story. They were looking out over the flourishing potential of the land, seeing not just the rye and the wheat that would come with the spring, but the endurance of a house that had finally stopped holding its breath. The silence of the night was complete, a peaceful shroud that covered the scars of the past and the injustices of the day. Arthur stopped at the crest of the hill, his gaze sweeping over the farmstead below. The windows of the cottage glowed with a warm, steady light, a defiant ember against the encroaching winter. He looked at Marianne, and for the first time in 10 years, the storm in his eyes had cleared entirely. He did not need to whisper the question again. The answer was written in the way she stood beside him, her spine straight and her spirit undiminished. They were equals in the only way that truly mattered, in the integrity of their character and the depth of their shared memory. As the dawn began to touch the horizon with the color of a bruised plum, the Duke and the woman who had once fed him turned back toward the hearth together, leaving the gilded world behind for a life that was finally and truly their own. True justice does not always arrive with the blowing of trumpets. Sometimes it comes in the breaking of a loaf of bread and the quiet decision to stay when the rest of the world expects you to leave. Have you ever felt that your kindness was a seed cast on stone, only to find it had grown into a forest when you needed it most? Let us know your thoughts on the power of being truly seen. May your hearth be warm and your ledger always balance. Good night from the fireside.